right, well, good morning to everybody. We are starting in Matthew chapter 12. And just as a reminder for those that are following along, you can have one of these handy-dandy outlines and handouts in a PDF form by just simply signing up for our free weekly newsletter at the website that you're seeing on the screen right now. And that is free. We'll get this in your hands so you can follow along. And we're starting Matthew chapter 12. And so I don't know how many sessions this will take. We're just going to work our way through. And I'm excited to be able to share this with you this morning. I love this chapter. There is a lot of great stories in this chapter. You're going to enjoy seeing Jesus talking about some theology and clarifying the reason he came. And he has some great references to the Old Testament. You're going to really enjoy getting into this chapter here. And I'm also very excited for chapter 13. We're getting into some kingdom passages there. But first, let's take on Matthew chapter 12. I kind of did the outline in more of a paragraph form. I'm sorry that's so wordy there, but let me just talk to you. This is a simplified outline just below this on your handout. So if you look at your handout, basically I'm taking that simplified outline and I'm going to put it into a paragraph form and kind of talk through what's going to happen in this chapter. Here's how we worded it. So Jesus' ministry continued to expand and his fame began to grow. The Pharisees became more and more critical of this rabbi who was undermining their authority. This led to them questioning Jesus' actions on the Sabbath day, verses 1 through 14. As a way of escaping this, Jesus withdrew himself, as Isaiah said he would, yet crowds still followed him, verses 15 through 21. This enraged the Pharisees even more, and they accused him of blaspheming and demanded a sign from him, verses 22 through 45. And when Jesus' immediate family went looking for him, he defined who his family was by identifying the disciples, those who obey his Father, verses 46 through 50. The simplified outline is on your paper. We're going to begin in the very first part of our outline is the clarification on the Sabbath, verses 1 through 14. Let's go ahead and dive in and read verses 1 and 2. And at that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." Now, there is a little bit of confusion here by the Pharisees. And we get a little bit more information if we consider Luke chapter 6 and verse 1. He has a little bit more information. In fact, there's a very important phrase in Luke 6:1 in our parallel that I'm going to show you. Luke 6:1 reads like this. Now it happened on the second Sabbath after the first that he went through the grain fields, and his disciples plucked the heads of grain and ate them. And it says this phrase, rubbing them in their hands. Now that's a key phrase for us to understand because the Pharisees were saying that they were working on the Sabbath day. As soon as they plucked grain and they began to separate by rubbing their hands, they were separating the wheat from the chaff. And that was one of the definitions of work, was separating wheat from the chaff. So that's why you would rub it in your finger. You kind of get that grain, that chaff out, and you kind of blow that in your hand and move it around and get that chaff out, and then you can eat the wheat. And once they did that separation, and they were basically working the fields, rubbing it in their hands, then they were in violation, the Pharisees felt, of the Sabbath day. Remember, it says in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 10, "But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you nor your son nor your daughters." So you can read this through, but it basically is just saying there's no work to be done at all on this day. And the Pharisees saw them and said, "Aha, look what you guys are doing. You're separating the wheat from the chaff. You're pulling this grain, and you're in violation of the Sabbath day." He says, "But he said unto them, have you not read what David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him?" Now Jesus is giving a little bit of historical context. He says, now wait a second, time out. Do you guys remember the story of King David? Now remember, King David is a hero to the Pharisees. So he's saying, do you guys remember what King David did? Verse 4. "He entered the house of God," that is the tabernacle, "and ate the showbread which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests." So Jesus was bringing this idea of this showbread. Now, I want to show you this in Leviticus chapter 24. We're going to do a little bit of turning in our Bibles here. Leviticus chapter 24. In verses 5 through 9, let me show you what the showbread was we're talking about. Inside the tabernacle, they had the showbread there, and it was to last for 1 week. And at the end of the week, the priests ate that bread as they made a fresh. What they did is they had 2 rows, I believe it was 2 rows of 6, and they were representative of the 12 tribes of Israel. And at the end of the week, the priests would consume this bread, and then they would also then bake more. And this is recorded in Leviticus chapter 24, verses 5 through 9. It says this, "You shall take fine flour and bake 12 cakes with it. 2/10 of an ephah shall be in each cake." And it gives all this very, very important instruction. In verse 9 it says, "Every Sabbath he shall set in order before the Lord continually, being taken from the children of Israel by an everlasting covenant. And it shall be for Aaron and his sons. They shall eat in a holy place, for it is most holy to him, from the offerings of the Lord made by fire by perpetual statute." Now, also I want to look at 1 Samuel. Now, this is going to be the record of David doing this. You say, well, what would cause David to do this? 1 Samuel chapter 21 and verses 1 through 7 is the record here. Here's the occasion that David found himself in. "Now David came to Nob, to Ahimelech, the priest. Ahimelech was afraid when he met David and said to him, 'Why are you alone and no one is with you?' So David said to Ahimelech, the priest, 'The king has ordered me on some business and said to me, do not let anyone know anything about the business on which I send you, or what I have commanded you. And I have directed my young men to such and such a place. Now therefore,' verse 3, 'what have you on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, or whatever can be found.' The priest answered David and said, 'There's no common bread on hand,'" common meaning something that you can have, "'but there is holy bread,' or hallowed bread, 'if the young men have at least kept themselves from women.' Then David answered the priest and said to him, 'Truly women have been kept from us about 3 days since I came out. The vessels of the young men are holy, and the bread is in effect common, even though it was consecrated into the vessel in this day.' So the priest gave him holy bread. For there was no bread there, but the showbread which had been taken from before the Lord, in order to put hot bread in its place on the day when it was taken away. Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord. His name was Doeg, an Edomite, the chief of the herdsmen who belonged to Saul." So we have this incredible story where David is hungry, and he goes to the priest and says, "Hey, I need anything you have. I'll take whatever bread you have." And they said, "All we have here is the showbread. And it's for us. I can't give this to you. It's set apart. It's holy unto the Lord. It's not common." And David said, "Well, I'm in a serious pinch here." And they're like, "Well, have you kept yourselves holy?" And David says, "Yeah. And we desperately need some food here." And the priest gives him the bread. This is what Jesus is reminding them of. And basically what Jesus is doing is saying, be consistent here. If you're going to condemn me and my guys for rubbing a little bit of wheat between our fingers out in the middle of an open field, do you also condemn King David? He's making them be consistent. Verse number 5 says this, "Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless?" So here's another question. If Jesus was to adhere to the Sabbath, he has a question. Because the Pharisees made it sound like every single person has to keep the Sabbath. And Jesus said, well, here's a question for you. What about the priests? Did they have to keep the Sabbath? Could the priests do any work on the Sabbath? And he says this, "Have you not read in the law," Jesus is saying, "that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane." Now this word profane means to make common. In other words, if you're a priest and you're on duty, then you're working. You have to work on the Sabbath. It's your job to be in the temple. So profane means to regard as holy, as holy, not regard as holy, or as ordinary. They made the Sabbath day ordinary because the priest that was on duty was at work on the Sabbath. And in this sense, they profaned the Sabbath because of his office. Does this make sense? So the priest would go in, they had a whole slew of things they had to do on the Sabbath. These priests would go in and work all day on the Sabbath day. And Jesus said, do you condemn the priests who make ordinary of the Sabbath? And of course they don't, because God commanded the priests to do that. Well, here's kind of a main point, isn't it? Jesus is the high priest. Jesus is the high priest. If you're not going to condemn the priest for working on the Sabbath, you can't really condemn Jesus for doing anything on the Sabbath. He's the priest. Be consistent. Be consistent. Verse number 6 goes on to say this. He says, yet I say to you, this is Jesus speaking, that in this place, that is where they are at the moment, there is one greater than the temple. In other words, what Jesus is saying is, not only am I the priest, I'm greater than the whole temple system. So, guess what? I have the authority as a priest to work on the Sabbath. But not only that, but I'm greater than the entire temple system put together. That's his claim. Now, you kind of get the feeling of why they hated Jesus so much. He's like, not only am I allowed to do that, the level of which I'm allowed to do that is beyond comprehension. I'm greater not just than any priest that's ever lived. Imagine the audacity of this Jesus of Nazareth in the first century, looking in the eyes of the legal, righteous people, right? That's what their job was, to study the law, these professional religious types. And he looked right at them and he said, oh, you're concerned about the Sabbath? Well, let's get something straight. I'm greater than any priest you've ever seen. In fact, I'm greater than the whole temple system. Oh, well, we now hate you, right? That's their response to him. So, not only is Jesus the high priest, but he's greater than the entire temple system. Now, I want to compare these two for you as we're getting going here. Numbers chapter 28. Just kind of keep these thoughts in your mind when you're thinking about the Old Covenant law. Numbers chapter 28 and verses 9 and 10 say this. Now, I want you to be in the mindset of everybody should obey the Lord. If he says something, we should obey him, right? Now, I want you to think about that. Keep that in mind and read these two with me. Numbers chapter 28, 9 and 10. On the Sabbath day, 2 lambs in their first year without blemish, 2/10 of an ephah, fine flour and oil as a grain offering mixed with oil with its drink offering. This is the burnt offering for every Sabbath, besides the regular burnt offerings with its drink offering. So what are you supposed to do on the Sabbath here? Well, you're supposed to do a whole bunch of stuff. Prepare all this stuff, make a burnt offering, prepare all these things in a very particular way. Now, who's he talking to here? He's talking to the priests. Okay? Now, jump over also after this. Let's go over to Exodus chapter 35. Genesis, Exodus 35. Now, remember, if the Lord said something, you have to obey it, right? Well, we just read that you have to make a burnt offering. You have to do all these things. But in Exodus chapter 35 and verse 3, it says this. It's concerning the Sabbath day. You shall kindle no fire throughout your dwelling on the Sabbath day. Well, Lord, what do you want us to do? Right? What do you want us to do, Lord? Is it to start a fire or to not start a fire? See, in Exodus 35, it says we can't start a fire. But over here in Numbers chapter 28, it says, you better start a fire for a burnt offering. Well, which is it? How do we resolve such a great conflict? Well, you better understand who's being talked to. It's the priests that were supposed to start the fire. It's the priests that were supposed to start this burnt offering. The folks who were not a priest were not supposed to start a fire. You see? But you can't possibly obey all the commandments of God. You can't obey both of these commandments. You have to know who he's talking to. These are contrary commandments. Okay? So it's easily solved by just understanding who he's talking to. That's the point that Jesus is making. He's saying, if you knew who you were talking to, you would understand why we're able to do whatever we want on the Sabbath in the sense of working. I'm the priest. These are my guys that are with me. I'm going to make them kings and priests. He says in verse number 7, but if you had known what this means, and then he quotes something here, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. He says, you would not have condemned the guiltless. Jesus here is talking about him and his disciples being guiltless. And he was saying to the Pharisees, guys, you know what your problem is here? And Jesus is quoting here the Old Testament. He's quoting Hosea chapter 6, which we'll look at in just a moment. You can turn there if you'd like. Hosea chapter 6. He says, if you had understood what Hosea was talking about in Hosea chapter 6, you would then have not made the mistake by condemning the guiltless. And then he says this, very, very important, because this is often misquoted, especially by Torah keepers. It says in verse number 8, for the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath. Now, a lot of the way that that's misquoted is a lot of people say that Jesus is saying that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. It does not say Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. Read it very slowly. It does not say Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. It says, for the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath. He's Lord of every day. And the Sabbath is a day. It's a much bigger statement than he's the Lord of the Sabbath. That's narrowing it down. It says that he is the Lord, full stop, even of the Sabbath. That's a very, very important distinction there. Hosea chapter 6 is what's being quoted here. And I thought it would be important for us to just kind of read the first several verses here, because we're talking about God calling Israel to repentance in light of the Messiah. Verse number 1, he says, come, let us return to the Lord, for he has torn, but he will heal us. He has stricken, but he will bind us up. After 2 days, he will revive us, and on the third day, he will raise us up, that we may live in his sight. Let us know, and let us pursue the knowledge of the Lord. His going forth is established as the morning. He will come to us like the rain, like the latter and former rain to the earth. O Ephraim, what shall I do to you? O Judah, what shall I do to you? For your faithfulness is like a morning cloud, and like the early dew it goes away. Therefore I have hewn them by my prophets. I have slain them by the words of my mouth. And your judgments are like a light that goes forth. For I desire mercy and not sacrifice. There's our quote. And the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. But like men, they transgressed the covenant. They dealt treacherously with me. And he goes on to talk further. But what Jesus is quoting here is saying to the Pharisees, if they had simply understood what Hosea was talking about, then they would begin to identify the difference between right and wrong. But since they didn't understand that, Jesus is saying that there's a problem in Israel, and it's a sin problem. And the sin problem in Israel is that they cannot make a distinction between the heartbeat of the law and having your heart far away from God, but technically doing something right. I've told this story before, and the illustration is a very, very old illustration. But I've heard this ever since I was a kid, so I'll just keep saying it. But there's an illustration of a young girl, and her father is correcting her. And she is supposed to be seated at the dinner table. And so he says to her, young lady, I'd like for you to sit down. And she's standing, and she says, I won't do it. I won't do it. And he says, sit down. And she looks right at her father and says, no. And she's standing. So the father stands up and starts to go towards her and says, sit down right now. And out of fear, she sits down. And the father, with great pride in his heart, walks away and says, now, that's better. Thank you for listening. And she looks at the mother and says, I may be seated, but in my heart I'm standing. Now, that's a very old illustration. I've heard that illustration my whole life. The point of the matter is, would you be pleased with your child if they acted like that and say, well, they ultimately obeyed me? That illustration right there encapsulates the Old Testament. You would never be pleased with your child to act that way. That's in many ways how Israel was keeping the law. Their heart was far from God, and they found these daily tasks to do as if just to satisfy the one that can hurt us. It became a religion. They're satisfying the God instead of the gods. They're satisfying the God so he won't hurt them. So he'll protect them and give them stuff. But their heart was far, far from him. This is what Jesus is talking about. Look again at verse number 6. He says, let's start in 5. Therefore I have hewn them by the prophets. I've slain them by the words of my mouth, and your judgments are like light that goes forth. For I desire mercy. Think of what God was saying here. I desire mercy. What is mercy? Mercy is not getting something you do deserve, right? Different from grace. Grace is what we would say unmerited favor. I think that's a pretty good definition. Grace is getting something you don't deserve. That's grace. Getting something, receiving in a positive way, something you don't deserve. Mercy is not getting something you do deserve, such as judgment. So withholding judgment is mercy. An abundance of riches is grace. Does that make sense? So in verse number 6, he says, I desire mercy. I desire to not give you that which you do deserve and not sacrifice. You think I want to just slaughter animals? I don't want to see animals slaughtered. I'd rather be merciful. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. I want you to be obedient. I may be seated, but in my heart I'm standing. He says in verse 6, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. Guys, I would rather you know who I am personally. I am a knowable God. He's a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. I would rather know you than you do a burnt offering to me. So he says in verse number 7, he says to the Pharisees, if you had known, in Matthew chapter 12, verse 7, if you had known what this means, and then he quotes, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. You guys are so off base here. He's saying to the Pharisees, you have no idea what it means to love people. You have no idea why the Sabbath was created. You have no idea. You're missing the mark on all of this. You are rule keepers and your heart is far from me. And then he answers and says by verse number 8, for the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath.